And I think the next artist actually is a good example of that, and maybe one of the most famous artists for this time period, and maybe one of the most successful artists, early artists, blues artists ever, until we get to maybe Robert Johnson, the lore of Robert Johnson. Um, and so this artist on the timeline, if you look down to the next artist, is Charley Patton. And Charley Patton, um, which interestingly enough, I think that just in modern times, a lot of people have really focused on Charley Patton's race. If you look on, I think if you just did like a Google search, I know mine probably won't come up that way because I look, my Google search, is gonna pull up a lot of blues, and more the algorithm is gonna be deeply entrenched in some more, I guess, nerdy blues topics than some other people. But I think if you just did a search on Charley Patton, pull up some of the more recent articles, there's a lot of focus, I think now retrospectively, on Charley Patton's race because he was mixed with, he was black, white, and Native American. I've never really seen anything more in depth on that, so it's kind of it's pretty what's the word? It's not very in depth. It's pretty vague as far as him being mixed. I think it became more of an interest because the blues, of course, is a deeply black genre, and mixed race individuals, interracial relationships, and all of that, even though it's been occurring for a long time, the focus and I think social acceptability and social focus on it was much more recent. So that may have been another avenue that you've heard of Charley Patton, but Charley Patton really is one of the most successful early Delta blues musicians. He's been referred to as the king of the Delta blues, and he was as we mentioned in the last episode. He was a songster, which were early music performers, generally in the South, who traveled around together and performed not only blues but a lot of other early music genres like ragtime, and performed ballads and different show tunes, and so he was more or less formally trained. He played with some different musicians in his area, but he, that Delta blues, he was in Mississippi, and by the way, Texas, where Blind Willie Johnson was, in Mississippi, are really the two hubs where you'll hear kind of back and forth, like this is where the blues, originated. So on one side we have Blind Willie Johnson as our Texas example, and we have Charley Patton, who was from Mississippi, and that was really a hub, and he actually grew up around a number of pretty well-known musicians, which we'll speak about in a moment. But Charley Patton, most importantly, was supposedly tutored by Henry Sloan, who, as far as people's word and limited documentation that we have for that time, Henry Sloan is considered maybe one of the earliest blues players known. So Charley Patton learned a lot from him. He learned from some other players who helped him become well versed in some other tunes as a songster. He didn't only play the blues, but the blues definitely became his focus, and what he was most well known for. Blues, of course, was one of the hotter, newer sounds at the time. It stood out as breaking a lot of rules, and it was also just, it kind of followed the social views of the blues at the time as Untamed. The blues, you had these musicians who were kind of coming up the ranks, and they were playing, Blind Willie Johnson had his contribution as far as his slide style, and Charley Patton had a very unique rhythmic playing style, very complex rhythmic playing style. So a lot of people were just adding this, and it was just kind of these sounds were not sounds that people had heard before, so it kind of it was an untamed music discipline in itself, but also whenever you have these newer genres that people haven't heard before that are kind of breaking on the scene, you attract a lot of younger listeners, and so the whole thing becomes new to a certain extent, new socially, new culturally, and so you're just gonna get a lot of formation, new formations on many different levels, and so it kind of appears to be, and in many ways is untamed and new, not only in music and song form, but also the crowd that you're attracting. So that's kind of why, perhaps the mainstream or certain areas of society are gonna push back a little bit on it, because it's not, it's covering a lot of topics that are seen as not socially acceptable or taboo by the mainstream. So Charley Patton was also really known for his showmanship. He's one of the earlier players who was, doing different guitar tricks. He played behind his head. He would throw his guitar up in the air, and so he was just really a really good messenger for the blues, and I think captures the essence of, not necessarily a Delta blues man. I think when you think of the Delta blues, people think of more of like a subdued individual who's kind of just a man who's kind of voicing his pains and hardships and life journey, the good and the bad, the heartbreak. And Charley Patton definitely had a lot of elements of that, if you really listen to the content and lyrics of his music, but also, you look at his showmanship and some of those aspects, and kind of his reputation with his relationships and the ladies. He embodied almost kind of that rock star image that we'll see more down the road. But he, being a guitar person that at this time, before amplification, it's very much a solo pursuit, and so he was largely playing on his own and putting on some great shows, and that definitely is enough. Besides, sometimes it overshadowed his great playing ability, I think. But regardless, looking back historically, I think everything is kind of captured, and Charley Patton is definitely one of the most successful blues artists. So as I kind of mentioned before, Charley Patton, because of where he started playing, Mississippi, early Delta blues man, so he was, within the community, he was pretty well known, and so there were other blues musicians that he was able to play with, such as Willie Brown, Tommy Johnson, and of course the great Son House. They toured, recorded together in a couple instances, and definitely played off each other. If you read into them and listen to some of the recordings, they covered each other's music, and I think really helped all together to shape the future sound of the blues. But Charley Patton definitely stands out, and he also influenced the next generation. You can hear some clear either exact title remakes with the same title, or very heavily based on some of Charley Patton's music. One big one is Howlin' Wolf Smokestack Lightning, is based on Charley Patton's Moon Going Down. Yes. And there are other examples of that, I believe, later on. I know Spoonful by Eric Clapton or Cream. I don't remember if he made that when he was with Cream. or not, but Eric Clapton's Spoonful is based on a song of the same name. I believe it's the exact same title of Charley Patton. But there's other examples out there, for sure. But specifically, Smokestack Lightning within that blues genre, within kind of that next generation, is I think one of the more well-known examples. And I guess another important note is that Blind Lemon Jefferson, who I don't have on the timeline, but is an important artist because he was one of the first Delta country blues type player to record a hit in 1926, which opened the door for musicians like Charley Patton, and these other musicians I mentioned to start recording, and of course their success became even bigger than his. But one of Charley Patton's, there's a couple examples of songs. I think that Charley Patton, number one, you can see that lyrically, his songs really reflect the blues style as far as sometimes since his songs were kind of put into a commercial pop context, people didn't necessarily read into his lyrics and what he's trying to talk about, and it was more, designed for entertainment. But when you really look back into some of Charley Patton's songs, he gets into, they follow a pretty traditional or common blues flow as far as addressing, and once again, this is kind of in contrast to Blind Willie Johnson's style as far as his music was very blues oriented, but the lyrical content was kind of gospel, or at least following that. The lyrics itself, the content was gospel, not necessarily following that gospel sound, but the content was very biblical, religious gospel. So Charley Patton really is the first artist we have on here that really is kind of bringing it all together lyrically, sound-wise, and of course innovating and contributing to the genre. And if you look at songs like Pony Blues, which is probably his biggest hit, he talks about some different, a lot of it goes around relationships or encounters with women, but he also gets a little bit into he talks about social status and some social issues that are impacting him specifically as a black man. And another important part, though, is just his guitar. The way he plays guitar is very, very unique. I actually have a quote somewhere from an article titled, or section titled, Pony Blues, an encyclopedia of great popular song recordings. Robert Palmer notes that the guitar part strongly accents the first beat of each measure, while the vocal is just as strongly accented on beat 4. Patton carries the note that begins on each accented fourth beat over into the next measure, producing the polyrhythmic effect of a 3-beat measure followed by a 5-beat measure over clearly delineated 4-beat measures of the guitar part. And so this is really trying to tie Charley Patton using his voice as not only an instrument as far as vocals, but also as a rhythmic device accompanying his guitar and creating sort of a polyrhythmic effect, which is interesting just because these are solo performances. So it's him and his guitar, He was also known for sort of tapping on his guitar in a drum-like fashion, um, as another rhythmic element, which you'll hear in his music. So all this kind of comes together to create kind of a polyrhythmic effect in different ways, different on different songs, and that ties back to polyrhythms in Africa, specifically West Africa. Of course, the modern music tradition is tied heavily to West Africa, but rhythm, um, complex rhythms, polyrhythms, could be seen across Africa. And so this is something that ties, those two things together, and that's something that they highlight. And polyrhythm is something that we'll come back to on a number of different areas as we go, but specifically as we see funk forming. Funk was a really big return to polyrhythm, or with a big emphasis. But at this point, it's interesting just because I think a lot of people think of polyrhythm in a drumming context. A lot of people don't necessarily take it out and think of rhythm as outside of a beat. People don't necessarily think of rhythm as notes, but of course, there's more than that. And I think specifically with Charley Patton is interesting just because we're combining guitar, vocals, and some percussion with him, tapping it or hitting his guitar, all in the rhythmic context. So I think that's something just to keep in mind as we move forward, because polyrhythm is a huge concept within the lineage.